He needs no introduction. You guys are here in full capacity. He needs no introduction. Nevertheless, tonight we welcome Walter Scott to the series. Walter is an interdisciplinary artist working across writing, video, performance, and sculpture. In 2011, while living in Montreal, he began a comic book series, which you all know and love. The comic book, Wendy, tells the story of a fictional young woman living in an urban center who aspires to global art stardom, but whose dreams are perpetually derailed. Wendy has been featured in Modern Painters, Canadian Art, Mouse Magazine, and Art in America. Walter's recent exhibitions include Big Toe Giant Steps at Occidental Contemporary in Paris, Ambivalent Pleasures Vancouver Special at Vancouver Art Gallery, and Walter Scott and Barb Choi. We'll let that go. It's Moose Magazine, not Mouse Magazine. At Gallery Weekend in San Francisco. Please join me in welcoming Walter.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everybody named Heather. So I wanted to begin with the first Wendy comic I ever drew, with no intention of it actually being a comic. In fact, it was a bunch of drawings, doodles on a placemat that I did at a diner in St. Henry in 2011. I was with my friend Jonas, and we were both hungover, and we kind of just wanted to make ourselves laugh and poke fun at our own lifestyle choices. So I went home after, and because I had nothing to do that afternoon, or most afternoons, because I didn't have a job, I photoshopped it and posted it on Facebook, and it got a bunch of likes. The last panel, not the end, is actually very much a premonition, I suppose. And then I was asked by a designer slash zine person named Audrey Cantwell, she made a zine at the time called Tarantula Sisters, and it was a zine that was documenting the sort of like punk scene in St. Henry at the time, punk and like fashion and interviews with like dudes in bands, whatever. It was like actually a very nice, like ambitious project, and she said, do you want to do 2 pages of Wendy for it? So this is the scene, by the way. This is the Fatale punk scene. How many people, show of hands, have been to a party in the Fatale building? How many people have been to a party in How many people have been to a party in the Fatale building, but in the by the train tracks? Okay, Matt, Anne, I know them personally. This is kind of what it was like. So it was kind of like that's kind of where the world of Wendy kind of sprang from, was this weird trackside punk Fatale loft thing that I was doing a lot of. And people who have been there especially might recognize in the bottom left-hand corner, what sort of it looked like there, with floorboard, wooden boards covering mud, and then a punk band playing inside. So at this point, Wendy didn't really have any aspirations to do anything besides document what was happening to me at the time. Until someone on Facebook said, if you make a book of this, I will buy it. And I said, that's something to think about. So I started to work on the book, and here I will neither confirm nor deny that any of this is based on personal experience, but I will say that Wendy is more or less semi-autobiographical. And it came to pass that I did, in fact, make a book of 60 pages, the first one, called Wendy. And I released it in November of 2011 at Exposine, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. I always, whenever I'm teaching classes with like teenagers, I always tell them that if they want like to sell their work, they could do it at Exposine, and it like blows their mind that they could do something like that. And yeah, so it was, you know, anyway, Exposine is good. So I released this in 2011, the first one, Wendy. 60 pages, self-published. I got the photocopy people to staple it for me. That was my one bougie thing that I did. And then the year after that, I released Trendy Wendy at Exposine in 2012. Whereas the first Wendy was kind of like these like punk adventures. Trendy Wendy dealt more directly with my experience of the art world as I was beginning to sort of like dip my toe into it in like a more legit kind of sense. And so here's an example. Here's a panel from Trendy Wendy. It's Wendy with stars in her eyes, attending her first artist residency in what would appear to be a mix between the Banff Centre for the Arts in Banff, Alberta, and Fogo Island, which is a residency off the coast of Newfoundland where the art admin people drive you to a salt box house in the middle of the island and leave you there. But you do get a really nice studio. So yeah, I guess I was sort of like sending up the culture of like artist residencies and this really bizarre idea that artists sort of just innately have it in them to be suddenly transposed, what's the word? Transported to some random location and then adapt and then thrive, when I feel like is that me and most of the artists that I know can barely leave our own house. In Trendy Wendy, I introduced a character named Winona, who is her, it becomes her friend. Her friend Winona is an Indigenous performance artist, more or less. And I thought Trendy Wendy would be a good opportunity to show what it's like from Winona's point of view, dealing with like contemporary art, and how she has to grapple with specific things about her identity that Wendy sort of gets a pass and doesn't have to deal with as much. Again, another sort of like way for me to create something that's semi-autobiographical, but from like a different character's point of view. At a certain point, some of the writing just feels like I'm arguing with myself. This is sculptural work from 2013. I'm currently doing my master's at the University of Guelph, and I'm focusing on my sculptural practice. So actually speaking out loud about it at this point is completely traumatizing because it's all I do. So I've decided now every time that a sculptural work comes up in one of the slides, I'm gonna just not say anything, and we'll just look at them. And then I'll just jump back into the talk. So this is me shutting my mouth starting now. That was really horrible for me. So to remind myself, like, to stay on track, I'm going to more or less talk about Wendy and the other ways of Wendy. So Wendy exists as a comic, of course, but she's existed sort of like in and out of different mediums and different modes of exhibition. And I'll highlight and talk about a few of them. Sometime in 2012, I got an email from Modern Painters magazine to do a back page feature for their section How It Is, which I suppose is their way of like, this is our back page that like gets real about what the art world's really about. So what a great opportunity to tell some kind of weird, it was just an opportunity for me to make really weird Wendy's, like this one specifically that's obscured by the huge Modern Painters logo. She interns for a gallery and then she meets this artist named, I forget, it's like something weird. A salvo. And someone was like, oh, that kind of reminds me of that other Orlan. And I didn't know who Orlan was, but now I do. But then she's completely like in awe and then in horror that a salvo thinks that she's like, I don't know, not interesting. Yeah, Starbucks jokes. In 2013, Art Metropole asked me to do an artist edition. So I thought it would be kind of funny to do like a Wendy fan club kind of like package. So this is wrapped in cellophane and it's a Wendy Starbucks bag, tote bag, and a 34-page lithographed zine and then a poster. And here's what happens when you unwrap it. I called it the Wendy Critical Reader because I thought it would be, I framed it as like, I want to talk more directly in this artist edition about the politics of art and like the politics of identity, and I wanted to include like very personal weird things. And I also included some critical, like some art writing from my friends Danielle Sinamore and Angela Loft to sort of frame it as like not just a book of comics, but also like this like document that brought other experiences and that sort of like enriched the entire like experience of reading it and like put it in context of like some larger conversation besides like, I don't know, Wendy gets drunk and then feels bad about it or something. And this is where I got to introduce really weird inflammatory characters, like useless urban person. Which at that point was like a send-up of myself because I had a suspicion that my roommate absolutely hated me. And I remember I was living in Vancouver and there weren't that many places to hang out. So I like went to Starbucks to write and I realized how ridiculous that is. And I was like, what does she think of me? So then I came up with useless urban person to sort of like put myself on blast, basically. And I don't think I'm wrong, but I gave him these accoutrements of very specific Vancouver hipsterdom, which is like these like suspenders and like weird hair and like weird mustache. Like there was like an editorial like fashion at the time in a Vancouver-centric magazine that was like, the new Vancouver man is a mix between English gentleman and Wyatt Earp and like cowboy who also brews his own mustache oil. And I was like, oh, so basically the modern man of Vancouver is every white man in history. In 2014, I released the first official Wendy book with an ISBN number through Koyama Press. And this book contains the first Wendy zine, Trendy Wendy, the second zine, and a third book of material that was made specifically for this, which like is about her going back to Montreal somehow, or like, I kind of forget now. Anyway, she works at a place that's kind of like KGB, and she's like dating her boss, even though she finds him kind of boring, and she thinks his art's kind of lame. But then he gets like really bitter and jealous because he feels like she's like super privileged and like, I don't know. Anyway, they both like kind of like hate each other a little bit. But then she doesn't show up for work on time, and then he fires her, but you know that it's kind of because like they don't really like each other. Anyway, it's like kind of like problematic. One thing that's interesting about making characters like that is that when I had to start doing like, okay, you're gonna have like your book launch now here and like a thing there, is that I thought it'd be boring. Like if it's like a normal book, you just sort of read from your book and people listen. But I realized it's really difficult to describe, like read from a comic book because you have to describe the panels or something. So what I did is, I didn't hear, but I project the panels and then I have people come up and they read the different characters. So like, I'll have like a young woman come up and like read as Wendy's like shitty boyfriend that she doesn't like that much, or like a 45-year-old man will come up and play Wendy. So all of like weird little things happen that are kind of like about identity or something, or like subjectivity and how it's like, some of the things that happen that are funny is like useless urban person, for instance, I imagine him as like super shrill and like, but like I've had people that come up and read him as like, you could even say that it's a part of a web-based contemporary practice. And one thing I think is funny is finding a way to do these things in places where I have difficulty showing like actual artwork, like commercial galleries. So it's a way to like infiltrate a commercial gallery and make something happen there in relation to the stuff that's already on the walls. And sort of like have people act out these narratives about the types of people that do go there, because those people actually are there and they're kind of just playing themselves. So yes, other ways of Wendy. The Random House of Canada's website, Hazlitt, asked me to do a scene report. They were like, can you do like a Montreal scene report? So I did something called the scene report, but then I moved to Vancouver, so I was like kind of all over the place. So I kind of just made these scene reports based on whatever city I was in at the time. And they also, besides being like city specific, like sort of parodying the city, because it was my experience of the city I was in at the time, they also started to veer into these kind of personal narratives. So I was able to inject like really like kind of personal things into these stories. Things like illness, the weird way that like public persona and like kind of certain circles of art worlds, like they sort of jut up against like very personal experiences like illness, but like I can never feel like I'll ever be able to consolidate the two. And then they unceremoniously let me go, but I won't. The hairpin, the thing about, okay, the hairpin was, I actually pitched to the hairpin because I was reading a lot of advice columns at the time. Does anyone read Ask Polly? Anyway, you should. It's like on New York Mag. So I was like at the time addicted to advice columns, like quirky advice columns, and I wanted to pitch my own. So I pitched art problems, Ask Wendy, and so it goes like this. Art problems, ask Wendy, and then there's a box that has a very small art world related question. For instance, dear Wendy, how many galleries can represent my work at once on each coast? I have so many offers from LA and New York and I can't choose. Love, trying to take life one day at a time. And then the format was that the answer would be a comic that's like completely unrelated to the question. Like this one, Medical Science of Depression. Oh great, it's sculpture time. That was really horrible for me. So I was invited by a Japanese curator from Canada, well, from Japan. Well, anyway, a Japanese Canadian curator to participate in a residency in Yokohama, Japan, in the summer of 2014. I already said that. And I was there for like 3 months or so, and it was a very strange experience because it was in the Korenacho district of Yokohama, which the residency program itself was part of this like burgeoning sort of, well, like city paid sort of art initiative, and it was in an alley. So this alley had all these small little apartments in them where sex workers would receive their clients. So it was like an alley of brothels, more or less. And tale as old as time, the city wanted to sort of clean up sort of like the reputation of the area, because also the Yakuza was like doing a lot of business in and around like the sex work, and they still have an office there. Like we were instructed only to walk down certain alleys. And so like they kicked out all the sex workers and turned it into like art studios. And so I was living in this like ex-brothel, and like I would like pee in the toilet and like scratch at the white paint, and the pink would still be underneath because like they were painted all these colors. And pink was a color in that neighborhood that was tied to sex work. And there were actually other like more commercial, like bigger like signs around that were pink, so you knew that it was like where you would go. So the curator was like, okay, like if you're going to do anything in public, any like public installation, nobody can use pink. Do not use pink because you can't do that. Which is fine because I like work mostly in black and white anyway, so it didn't really concern me, but I thought it was interesting. But it's like really unfortunate after, because this sign, it says Wendy for sale, and she kind of like looks like a ghost, and it was almost like this, by accident, this weird sort of like the ghost of the former economy of this place. And I still feel really conflicted about like that sign being up because of that, but I think you kind of have to reach a little bit to like get there. Or maybe you don't. So the sign was actually just like, there was money in the budget, so she was like, you can make a sign, you can make a sign, and we all just made these signs. The meetings were like, okay, so you'll do this, do you want to make a sign? So, you know, if anyone wants to buy a sign, I have a sign for sale. So the real project was this zine. Well, I guess I should point over here. This Japanese comic book. It was 36 pages of material in and around sort of like my adventures in Japan at the time. It's like really, really disorienting to write things as they're happening, but I did it somehow. I got very ill. I had a breakdown. I went to a Japanese hospital. It cost $40. It was totally chill. But I had a lot of people immediately saying like, when is this going to be released in English? When is this going to be released in English? And I had actually no intention to release it in English at all. Because I thought it was interesting to think about how like, okay, so I'm from Ganawake, and I went to Mohawk immersion until 4th grade, and then I went into English school in 5th and 6th, and then went to high school like off the res. And like my understanding of the Mohawk language, it's almost like I'm looking at it through a foggy window. Like I see like the forms of it, but it's never quite there. But it's weird. Okay, like put a bookmark there, and then when people look at Wendy, they assume it's all for them. Like it's like this, I relate to this, it's mine, it's a part of my experience, and I transfer a lot into it, and I get out of it. It's like this conversation, and then when you sort of like stop that, it sort of creates this disorientation where you feel like something belongs to you, but you can't access it. And that's sort of how it feels to feel like I have an ancestral language that belongs to me, but at the same time, I don't have it. So I just wanted to sort of like create a project that might approximate what that feels like. But then I decided to be less of a jerk, and I found a way to present the work in English. And the way I did that was in 2014 at the Toronto Images Festival, I did a performance called Wendy Live, where I projected the panels in Japanese behind me, and then me and my friends Angela Loft and Hiroki Tanaka performed the material in English. A note about the book was called Wendy Yokohama Misadventure Artist Love Stories. And a note about it is that I made stories in that book specifically about Winona's experience as an artist, like living on her like native reserve. And I thought it was an interesting thing to like have stories from one culture directly to like an audience in Japan. And like to see like what they thought of it. I never found out what they thought of it because no one really seemed to talk about the work that we made, and then I like left Japan. Yeah. So another thing that Wendy does that I do is this sort of like science fiction Wendy called Zendi. It's like the science fiction alter ego of Wendy. She sort of like lives in this like sci-fi universe. And what I do is I realized that I was making these performances of Wendy material, either performed just by me or by other people. And from there, it was a leap into like, well, why don't I just start making these scripts specifically to be performed? So I made a sci-fi multimedia performance called Wendy's Revenge, but like it's about Zendi, but I called it Wendy's Revenge because I thought if I made it Zendi's Revenge, people wouldn't know what the fuck it was and they wouldn't come. But like, because Wendy is kind of this weird thing that everyone knows. Anyway, I fooled people into coming to this thing. And so here's like a smattering of examples of what the artwork would look like that I projected behind me, like while I was speaking. It's like a science fiction tale about her meeting like her ex-boyfriend. The plot of this performance is she has her naturopath who lives in a space station tells her that to find the source of her abdominal pain, she has to find her ex-boyfriend and kill him, and that she could tell that by looking at her fingernails. But like while she's on her way doing this like intergalactic journey to find her ex-boyfriend and kill him, she encounters like, she goes like under the sea of a planet made out of kombucha, and she finds a curator like swimming around, and she rescues her, but it turns out she's actually a gallerist, and then like, she kidnaps Zendi and like puts her in her commercial gallery prison. And but like so it weaves itself through like art theory and like critical confession and like illness and like weird somatic stuff and also weird sort of like affective. There's like a scene that's like affective is trending right now. Just sort of like trying to put all these weird things in my life and like make them into this weird like kombucha meteor of like a narrative. So my alter ego has an alter ego. Another way of Wendy is what I like to call these movie trailer posters. I was going to release another book soon, and so Mercer Union in Toronto in 2015 had and they continue to have a billboard on the side of Mercer Union, and they have monthly programming where they ask an artist to put an image on the billboard. So I decided to take an excerpt from the upcoming book and like sort of change the artwork a little bit, just to make the format better for the billboard. And so I presented this, and it's Wendy. She's in bed. She looks in the mirror. She dyes her hair black, and the poem says, I began to evolve tentacles, branches that held different fictions of me at once, a perpetual hydra that thrives through the navigation of decay. And I'll just speak a little about why we thought it was good for like that billboard is because it's a mixed occupancy building. There's like art stuff happening on the first floor and then like private things happening on the other floors. So people are presumably washing their hair or having sex or crying or cooking. And that like the mixed occupancy of the building sort of, yeah, like the comic kind of talks about that, but then also the neighborhood itself is like kind of getting this cosmetic overhaul. Things start getting more expensive and younger people start moving in. You know, again, tale as old as time. Another book trailer is this thing that says writing a 1,000 page novel 2,000 feet underground. So when you're walking around Vancouver, there's this picture of Wendy just like on her phone, walking around, writing a 1,000 page novel. And then you go around and you enter the Yaletown, this is in Vancouver, the Yaletown Roundhouse station. Anyway, so it says writing a 1,000 page novel 2,000 feet underground. So you're kind of implicated, like the viewer's implicated in the artwork by like literally having to travel like underground to get to the passage about being underground. And for me, like I made this just to sort of muse about like how, like Vancouver's kind of a lonely place. Like I spend a lot of time just in my own head, walking around alone, just being like alone. And a lot of like rumination, like one of my hobbies is like ruminating. And like it was like a perfect place to do that or like become engulfed in that. So I kind of wanted to use it to make this artwork to like speak to like the sort of emotional experience of living in that city. And again, Wendy has another alter ego, a woman with a drill for a head. So in 2015, I released Wendy's Revenge, and I included the Japanese material in English there. And mostly, like the first half, for instance, is about Wendy's experience in Vancouver. This is her having to ride a bike, like, more often than usual, which is like, you know, I didn't really like riding bikes that often, but in Vancouver you kind of have to if you want to get places. And so, in the book, she's interested in this writer that's like a satirical version of Kathy Acker called Kate Ecker, who is like right here. And some of the book is narrated through the fictional writing of Kate Ecker, so I got to do like a Kathy Acker impression in my writing, and like make all of this prose in the Wendy universe as like a writer from the 70s. And the 80s and 90s, I suppose. So outside of Wendy, like Wendy is a very structured thing. It's like, it's all boxes and like thinking both macro and micro, like you're thinking of a huge narrative and you're breaking it down and it's like very exhausting and you're trying to think about what it means in relation to your own life, and then you're pulling your own life and like breaking it into pieces and putting the best parts and the most, it's like kind of the worst. So then like in grad school, I just start making drawings of dogs wearing funny hats. It's like a traumatic response. But I suspect they have some merit because I'm able to sort of like write something around them that legitimizes them, which is that they're these characters that they perform rituals of boredom and anxiety and like through like things like having only one sock on, which means that you jerked off and like threw the other one away, and like stereotypes of like the billowing window pane or like time passing by. It's a way for me to fall deep into like very traditional tropes of romance and boredom and anxiety and all of that. And like bits of narrative leak into them, like this one, he's reading The Drama of the Gifted Child. I actually wouldn't suggest anyone read that unless you're like really ready. This one's inspired by a Hall & Oates music video. I put moccasins on him because like, why not? It's funny when you include something like moccasins in a drawing that otherwise is whatever, because then people like try so hard to find a way into it from an indigenous perspective. Anyway, whatever. That's just something that, anyway. And then yeah, you know, trying to pull yourself out of a pit of resentment and because you believe in love, maybe. So other ways of Wendy. This summer, I was invited by the plugin ICA in Winnipeg to lead a residency. And I was jazzed about it because Chris Kraus led the Summer Institute last summer, Summer Institute #1, and then a few weeks later I was asked to run Summer Institute #2. So I got to say things like, oh, well, you know, like Chris Kraus, and then it's like, oh, but then it's like, and these are the participants, and a lot of them are from Winnipeg, and then a couple are like from here, and one of them is in the audience tonight. Yeah, and it was a group of like really rad people, and it was called the Wendy Book Club because I thought it'd be interesting to like what would happen if you create like semi-academic, sort of like art like discussion around this like fictional character that goes through these things, like through these institutions and through these networks. This is me like looking really scary at somebody. Like I didn't realize it, but whatever. I know I can look like that. So what we did is, and maybe I shouldn't have led it directly myself. I should have put people in a room and just sort of went to get coffee or something. But what we attempted to do was use the source material, like Wendy as source material to talk about concepts in the art world, and how like our own experiences of them are. So there would be like, read like this chapter and then read this chapter and then read this chapter. It was like kind of successful, but I think like the thing that like happened that was really, really good was like it sort of evolved on its own into this like weird skill sharing thing. This really great person, Kelly, taught like a metal, like a wood workshop thing, and like how to drill and like kind of like use power tools and stuff. And like I literally like never really knew how to do that, but like she called it like wood workshop for sissies, and she had this like really chill way of like, because I think she knows that like there's this like intimidation factor in like having to learn tools, because it's always like someone really macho and like shitty trying to like be like, no, it's wrong. And like I like sent her a DM once like when I was really drunk, and I was like, oh my god, like I am so happy you did that for me, because like really, really like others don't think I ever would have like learned that much. Anyway, she's cool. And then this is a picture of my friend. She's her name is Tao Lewis, and she's an artist that's. Do people know who Tao Lewis is? She's a young artist based in Toronto, and she makes these portraits, sort of made out of found materials, and like she's a big fan of like stuff that you'll find on the street, like garbage and like rebar with like concrete like stuck around it. So like she showed up and like just went around Winnipeg and like found a bunch of garbage, and she was like, Winnipeg is like surprisingly clean, and like I couldn't find anything. Not surprisingly, she wasn't like being shady, but she ended up having just this workshop where we just sat around, we all just made things out of garbage. And the whole thing ended up just being, yeah, like stuff like that, like a bunch of people just hanging around and like chatting and just like sharing like skills with each other. That's not right. And then, so I like also made this installation on the front of the plugin ICA, like in conjunction. Well, actually, it was installed before Crisscross's residency, so she basically led her residencies inside of my artwork. And yeah, it's kind of like a throwback to like my interest in animation when I was a teenager. Like I used to make claymations as a teen, like obsessively. And this like DNA, this animation DNA is inside of me and it's never gone away. So I saw the sequential like nature of the windows and I thought it'd be a good opportunity to make these eyes. Especially since they're pointing at like the Hudson's Bay. There's like a weird historical thing, this thing of like looking at the like reading the buildings in a way, and like looking at them and like clocking them as like having some historical thing. Yeah, that's what my artist statement says exactly. And so I guess we're nearing the home stretch. This is what my studio looks like at the University of Guelph. And the health and safety came in for some other reason, but they saw a bottle of wine amongst this like mess, and I guess it just painted a picture for them of like a very, very like mentally ill person, and they kind of had a fit, and then I have like a cot in there too, and like I could just imagine how horrified they were because this like department-wide email like was sent around after that. So anyway, this is what my studio does to people. And I suppose this is like a vulnerable part of my talk because this part of my talk is like not long at all, but it's just, here are images of things that I'm working on right now that I'm not sure of or what they mean or where they're going or if I should even make sculpture at all, like blah, 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 like MFA, existential. Yeah, I've been using plaster. This work isn't finished. And like using weird things with fabric and found objects, like sticking them together. But anyway, back to Wendy. So just like 2 nights ago, I opened a show at the Université de Québec in Ottawa, in Gatineau. And they are the only place, I think, in Canada with a comic writing degree, and it's in French. And so the curator thought it'd be interesting to like have a show of Wendy stuff, and in that university, so that like people who are doing that degree especially can like come, but also like everybody, obviously. And it was like a really fun exercise in interior design. And we made a couple of light boxes. We made a curator's hate her light box. Everyone remembers the dermatology like pop-up, right? Where she's like pulling her own face. So that's what it looks like, a little reading area. That's it, thank you. So this is everyone's favorite time, the Q&A.
Do you mind? Have you got a few?
Of course not, no, I totally would. I shall.
Thank you. We've got mics. We want to hear the questions on the recording, so could you pass this to Damien? Oh, check for a green light. Yeah?
Yeah, this works. Thank you very much. It was great to go through Wendy with you, Walter. Thanks. There was something you said something about should I make sculpture at all?
Should I?
There's one thing that I noticed, and this will be traumatizing because I'm going to talk about your sculptures as well. There's two motifs, and it's just, I've trained as an art historian for years, so this is a very deep question. Two things I've noticed, two motifs I've noticed from Wendy to your drawings, the dog drawings, and your sculptures, eyes and hair. That's the question.
Oh, and I guess Wendy has long hair too.
there's a lot of hair in a lot of your work, and eyes predominate. All sorts
This
of
like
types of eyes.
I can give one answer that doesn't necessarily illustrate. I mean, it might. Okay, I'll just say like one thing. When I was growing up, like my dad was in the Marines, and like he always gave us these like shitty haircuts in the kitchen. Shitty, like little crappy buzz cuts, and like I guess was cognizant enough to like dislike how I looked when I was like 10 or 11 or like 5. Anyway, whatever. So I think I'm just kind of rebelling against this weird like Marine dad giving me shitty haircuts, and like I always wanted long hair, and actually I am staying at my friend's place, and she has I was in a punk band. We were called like Italo Mohawk Punk. Our band was like me and 3 women from Montreal, and our band name was Dead Wife. I apologize. And I was like wearing wigs all the time, and like in the liner notes of the LP is a picture of me wearing this like black wig, and I look really witchy. So I think I've had a desire to have long hair for a long time, and it was only in 2013 I got really sick all of a sudden, and I felt like it was tied with me sort of like repressing something, and I was like, I'm not gonna cut my hair anymore. And so I think maybe it's like this is personal, but like it's like it's got me thinking about hair and how it's kind of like tree rings, you know, like the longer your hair grows, the hair is a passage of time, and every part of your hair is like a specific time in your life, which is, I suppose, why when people cut off their hair, like there's like this weird emotional like difference. So yeah, I guess hair is just for me like a very personal like symbol, and so that's why that's there. And eyes, I don't know, I guess I'm just like any like person. It's really weird, like I'm teaching and as part of my degree, like I teach undergrads, and there's so many artworks where it's like an eye. So I guess I'm just basic.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. I apologize if it's an unpleasant question, but I'm sure you asked yourself that. Is there some kind of worry or maybe just questioning regarding Wendy maybe overshadowing your sculptural work, or do you just embrace the great positive reception of Wendy and that's fine with you?
I always make a joke, like, it's like how Keanu Reeves is in a band, but everyone like, is like, oh well, you're an actor, and he's probably like, oh, I'm a musician too, or something. And I'm like, yeah, but like you're an actor, you're not a musician. So yeah, I guess it's a little bit like that, sure. That could feel kind of horrible, yeah. But I don't know, whatever. The sculptural stuff is just always like evolving and changing, like if it doesn't get the same sort, like how could it really in a certain way, like one thing that's come up like this year is that like the Wendy work sort of has this like social function, right? And in the sense of it gets disseminated in these like very like explicitly social ways, like through the internet and like through billboards and through books, and it's like it's disseminated in this way that people can put in their bag or whatever. And like sculptural work, like it doesn't do the same thing. It doesn't circulate in the same way. And like there's sort of like the entry points into the sculptural work are very different. If I were to replicate the entry points in the sculptural work that I do in Wendy, it would just become these weird sort of 3D puppet looking things, right? Like my biggest nightmare is when people are like, oh, like this one is kind of like Wendy Comes to Life. And I'm like, oh great, yeah, I guess we're in Jim Henson's studio. And so I actually don't really have any issue right now with like, if this sculptural work is unresolved, because I think, again, it functions almost like outside of like the social function that Wendy does.
Thanks. And just a quick follow-up. There was another way of Wendy, if I remember, in last year Montreal Biennale, a neon work. Is this something you're still doing?
Oh, I forgot to include that. Yeah, so I did. I made a Wendy. Like no, it wasn't actually a Wendy thing. It was like an animated neon work that was someone sort of like headbanging like this. And yeah, what was the question about the work?
No, just if it's something you still do, or it was a single neon work. And I thought it was a Wendy work for some reason.
Oh yeah, it's like it has. Yeah, it kind of like looks like Wendy, and the only reason why I did a neon work is because I never made one, and the Montreal Biennale this last year was just a good opportunity to do something like that.
Questions?
Hello.
I just want to tell you, I personally really feel connected to Wendy in a way, like, I think it's me. And I'm asking myself, like, is it, you think it's because I'm a woman from Montreal, also artist reaching to this kind of similar alternative scene? Or like in your traveling, residency experience, you have this feeling that this character can reach more global, more like international, and everybody make like in Japan or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
What is your like feedback on this question?
I get a lot of questions about authorship, especially because there's a weird inversion. Because like, you know, like in terms of identity, like queer, indigenous, and like cis male, and then like white, straight, female. Like there's a lot of inversions of both power and not power that are happening there, and so I'm encouraged by the fact that many different people sort of identify with her adventures because. In some ways, some of her adventures and some of the things that she deals with are like these like like say gender specific, for instance, like I don't know, like having diarrhea or something. There's like a shared sort of like genderless anxiety that we all sort of share in the art world, and so yeah, I'm encouraged when like her relatability like happens in that way. Yeah, and I think I also like to create these like, it's actually an interesting question for me of like how much of her experiences are universal, you know? And I had someone say like, oh, like you write like women like very, very well. And I thought that was like funny because I was like, well, she's just basically dealing with the shit that I deal with, so yeah, I think that's all I can say for now. I mean, that's all I can say about that question. I can still answer questions.
Oh, come on. There's a whole graphic novel writing class here. I know you're here. Patrick's people. Sure.
Yes, just a question about Vancouver, if you think that it's an inspiring city to live in, or is it what's the art scene, and if you felt like it was a good place to thrive as an artist?
Does anyone want to start a Vancouver support group? I'm just kidding. I really, really love the conceptual art that's coming out of Vancouver. And like when I was there, like I felt like there was a rigor and a very specific, like kind of migraine-y way sometimes, but like people there like really, really ask like every single question possible about everything, which I think is really important. It's not much fun, but like I went to the Vancouver Triennale and that was like super chill. I don't know, like I think that there's like different cities make different things, and like Vancouver's really, really good at like a certain thing. But like the most annoying thing ever is like when cities compare themselves against other Canadian cities. Like it's like, oh my god, like get real or something. Montreal doesn't really do that. Montreal doesn't care. But anyway, yeah, Vancouver's fine.
You just felt it's a different approach.
Well, maybe I can. I can say something else about Vancouver, I guess, instead of that. It's just fine. It was the beginning of my sculptural practice, and somebody very generously told me, and I think it's because of the like Vancouver influence that I made them, but somebody was like, oh, your work is kind of like if Jeffrey Farmer, Brian Youngin, and Liz Magor had a baby. I think that's really nice. But I don't know, maybe I have to move to Vancouver for my sculptural work to be more interesting. I don't know. But yeah, Toronto's a very social city, so maybe that's why I'm more comfortable making this like social comic book work about being social all the time.
Whereas you felt lonely in Vancouver, that's what.
Well, in Vancouver, if you go to an art opening, you talk to the one person that you know, and then everyone else is doing that. But if you go to an art opening in Toronto, you have to do your rounds and check in with every single person that you know at the. So like those weird like little social differences, I think, sort of like they sort of like leak into the kinds of works people make and the way they talk about work and stuff like that. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I know with cartoonists sometimes you have writers who draw and sometimes you have drawers who write. And I'm just wondering, chicken and the egg question here. In your process, what usually comes first? And do you start with an image often, or do you kind of mix and match? Like how much of it is scripting first or thumbnailing first?
I want to go back. I want to just go to the first slide. God, there's so many slides.
Yeah, that one started as just a sketch, but do you ever
So
have a script and then work from the script?
Okay, so let me just like describe my process a bit. So like something will come to me like, okay, like I want to make a story about Wendy going to LA, but then I'm like, but like why? And I'm like, well, because something. And then I'll be like, oh, I want to do this thing where she's wearing this outfit that she hates and she's trapped at this opening. And I have like a vision of like her face going like, oh my God, my outfit is so bad. But she's like looking at herself in the mirror, like at the opening. And then I like build a story around that. And then I write it out like in a notebook, just like the dialogue like this. It's too bad I don't have like pictures of my sketchbooks. So it'll be like a document of the dialogue that I genuinely want to get across, and then like some really quick sketches of the facial expressions that go with like certain moments, and then I'll write like I'll do like little two shots of like, and then here's a bit of silence, and then here's like the punchline, and then here's a beat. So it's almost like this weird little hieroglyph of like, this is how the story's gonna go. Again, it's way easier to describe just to have a picture of it, right? And then I take that and I go into like the paper and then I pencil in the panels and then I ink them and then I scan them. Does that answer, or do you want to know something?
How much do you feel the writing serves the imagery and vice versa?
Oh, I think it's really, really important to have it be like a perfect balance, because like, despite what people might assume, like I actually have a really hard time reading graphic novels. Like they're not my favorite thing in the world. Like some of them like are really, really like awful to read because you're reading them, or like the work is like the like drawing is really complicated and there's like too much information. Like my brain just gets like scrambled if it's like too like complicated. So like I feel like because comics are an extension of language in a certain way, that like a very like calculated sort of economy of like using words and images is important. And I like to be able to have like panels where either like the writing is doing 80% of the work and then the like picture is doing 20, and then sometimes it's 50-50, and it's like this weird delicate balance that like you're just basically spinning plates from like start to finish when you're like making the final artwork and the story. And so a really good graphic novel that does that really well is Fun Home by Alison McDowell.
Hi. You said representation of your experiences. Can you talk about your need or the reason why you transpose your alter ego into a female character? And do you think the comic would be as popular if it had been a male character?
The question I ask myself is more than that is if the comic would have been popular if it was an indigenous character. Because in that situation, people sort of like walls go up when they see something that's like specifically like indigenous, for instance. And I think one of the reasons why Wendy like was a female character was because she was sort of born during a very specific time in pop culture where women's experiences in urban center sort of sprang up. So there was like Girls, and this like really awful show, Two Broke Girls, which I'm just, like, I don't know why it's still on. It's like the worst fucking show. And because her subjectivity, there's like the feminization of like a lot of different people under patriarchy. It was like a character that could very directly sort of like speak not just for women but like for like a feminized experience, or like a marginalized experience, or just like a non-white experience or a non-male experience. And also so many cartoon characters are like just similes of their author, which is like a sad guy. Like it's like so many comics just like a sad guy jerking off and he's like mad about the girl that won't fuck him. Like so many fucking graphic novels are that. Because so many comic artists are that. Like I could not do that. I guess with the dog drawings I kind of do, but that's different, they're dogs. So yeah, it was like, you know, whatever. I identified more with the girls that I hung out with at parties than the punk guys anyway.
Jules?
Yeah. So in Wendy, in addition to kind of skewering just this kind of like useless wasteoid lifestyle, you also skewer a bunch of just kind of art world conventions, like going to a show and like. Oh, is the switch on? There's so many. Can you not hear me? Anyways, I said that in addition to kind of skewering in the comics this like, Montreal wasteoid lifestyle, you also skewer the kind of the conventions of the art world, like from the kind of I like especially the kind of language tropes that are used to just talk about art. And I noticed that in the talk, like every time you kind of skirt over making what is a serious artist statement, I guess, serious like quotation marks there. Are these kinds of conventions things that you just hold in contempt totally, or why do you not is it just a fact that it's Wendy is a very social artwork that you try not to use too much language that you feel would alienate people? Do you think that there's any kind of merit to sort of art specific jargon and that sort of, because I feel like it's presented as being really pretentious, and I was just wondering if you see that sort of any kind of value in using it at all, or if it's just this sort of totally useless, superfluous, contemptible, fake thing to you.
Yeah, like use of language. It's like for one, my experience in my MFA is like full of like that sort of specific use of language, and I don't think it's entirely useless. I think the type of language you use, it's really specific, depends on sort of the context that you're in. I do see sort of the way people use academic language occasionally to elucidate what their point, but it can very quickly become a way to position themselves in this position where there's like a jockeying of power in the conversation, and the ability for that to render the person that they're discussing something with kind of helpless if they don't sort of share the same lexicon. And so occasionally, like maybe people who use that language are empathetic or sympathetic in my comics, because sometimes that's all the language that people have, like especially if you've been in academia forever, like you literally don't know how to talk in any other way, and like that is also like a sympathetic place, because this person is just going to alienate themselves constantly from everyone around them outside of their academic like context. It's just like too bad, but also whatever. But you know, I kind of like have that too. I feel, I mean, we all do. I mean, winter break is coming, and like we're all gonna feel like fucking aliens, like in relation to our family. So I pity myself, is what I'm saying. And I don't think it's like contemptible, if that's a word, to have an academic like way of speaking, or you know, like this certain knowledge base or this way of like discussing things that are important to you or things that require it. I just think it's important to understand the context that you're in when you decide to use it or not use it. And I guess in the world of Wendy, hilarity ensues when you don't do that. So yeah, academia is fine, I guess is my answer.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Just like following on that, I'm just wondering if you feel that like your sculpture needs to be expressed in those kinds of terms, or like if Wendy is like so much more accessible.
Well, I feel like making Wendy is a lot funner than making sculptures for me right now. And I think it is just because of this very specific time and context in my life of the sculptures having to function in and around this language, because it's art that I'm making during my MFA, right? And so yeah, I think it is like sometimes a little bit oppressive to feel that it's going to be like read in that context and be talked about in that context, and if it doesn't fit that context, like you're always being asked to solve this problem. So yeah, that's very difficult, and that's where I'm at. So that's where a lot of people here are at, I'm guessing. Unless you're all investment bankers, and I have no idea.
Are we done, or can we do one more?
I could like sit here all night.
There you go.
Mostly because I have like well, actually I just have a quick question though.
And a bunch of people probably have to pee. I heard someone say, I do.
I just have a question about the role you think that comics can play in the contemporary art world.
Yeah. Well, it's weird because I feel like in a lot of other places in the world, they're not really seen as like two different things. But I guess maybe in North America they are. Comics, like, because they have this status of being just outside of the art world, it gives them the opportunity to sort of be like, blah, 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 like, here's my, like, critical take on what's happening in the art world, but then be like, but that's none of my business, you know? Like, it's a way to, like, comment without being fully in it, and therefore you kind of, like, get, like, the ability to, anyway, yeah. That.
So it's for the most part external.
What's external?
The comics and the art. So essentially, it functions for you as a commentary on the art world, but not from the art world.
No. I think a lot of the projects, like the billboards, and even just like showing comics in a gallery, and like the sign, like all of these weird ways of trying to see how Wendy functions as actual contemporary art in and around contemporary art venues and institutions and stuff is also this weird problem that I'm trying to solve. Or like, what does it mean when comics sort of like function like contemporary art? Like, I think it makes us sort of see how like certain kinds of cultural production like bump against each other, and what happens when that like looks or feels weird, right? And I think that is tied to my interest maybe in how like personal experiences and experiences of yourself as a public like artist or instructor or person in institution, sort of, they also bump against each other. So, thank you.
I kind of want to keep it going. I've been to all the SICAs for the last little while, and this is the best Q&A I've seen. So if you're up for it, a couple more, is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
So you were. I have a microphone. You were interested in animation as a teenager in stop motion. Is that coming back eventually, or is that an extension of your comic book practice that you would like to see happen? Is that fine as a comic book form? Or would you see it in animation anytime?
I had people who were interested in turning Wendy into an animated series, but I mean, not that it would like actually happen, but you know, you get a phone call and then you never hear from them again, kind of thing. I won't say who, but like, I don't know, maybe other people feel differently, but I think if you animated Wendy, it would totally take away from the humor of Wendy, because then it would become in the language of like whatever animation company decided to make it look like, and then suddenly like a wiggly facial expression just becomes too much of a real thing in a different way, and it's not as funny. Like, so that's something I like struggle with. I don't think I could see Wendy animated, really.
In that way, you would have lost control on some of the content, or they would have take over.
I mean, if Wendy ever gets made into a TV series, I totally see that happening anyway. And I actually think it might be funny if Wendy gets made into a really bad show. Just kind of like more as like a Wendy cultural experiment of like, okay, it's bad, but like this is what happens when Wendy gets transposed into television, right? I think that's actually fine. I mean, I say that now, but.
Okay, can I ask a question? But it won't count. There are two more out here.
It's a bit fuzzy.
Oh,
Yeah, it's fuzzy.
sorry. Just on animation, maybe you could say a couple of things about the NFB project you did.
Oh yeah, that was really interesting because I did this project called Zenona, which at this point you may understand as Winona, but the sci-fi Winona. And I was asked to do a multimedia project through NFB, and they said there's an opportunity to make like a multimedia thing that you see on the internet, like with music and sound and animation. And you can find it if you Google Zenona, Walter Scott, it'll come up. That's Xinona. And like I signed a contract, I was like, okay, whatever, let's do this, like, you know, I need to eat, or whatever. It was like, I wanted to also try something maybe new. But then like, I realized like, well then like, they explained a little more what it was, and then I realized it was a Canada 150 project, and that it was one of a string of essays about Canadian identity. And I was like, fuck! And in the meetings, when I revealed like my indigenous subjectivity, there seemed to be an interest in that, and I think it was especially in relation to the way that the work would function, because the other animated essays in the collection were about another element of Canadian identity. And I was like, fuck! Because like, then I was like, well, then I have to sort of decide now, how am I going to like navigate around this like sort of like breathless ethnocultural essay, which has so many trappings and especially sometimes in the way that things are produced, like in the way that they sort of perpetuate narratives that we're used to talking about. They also perpetuate the oppressive things that make those things possible. Which is like a whole other conversation. But I was like, do I want to toe the line of like some sort of like breathless experience of my indigenous identity that people will immediately understand and know how to feel emotionally about? Because everybody likes to be able to feel something recognizable, you know? Like, oh, that's really unfortunate and we need to do something different. I know, like we all know that. So then I decided, okay, like I'll make Zedona and it'll be the sci-fi story about her getting commissioned by this government that has 3 heads. It was very like liquid television, MTV looking. And then they ask her to make this artwork about like the Confederation of Planets. So it was just like an allegory for what I was going through at that exact moment. And the NFB like actually like thankfully they said like this is like interesting and funny, like just do it. Because it's kind of like putting themselves on blast in a way. So I did that and it kind of like, the reception I got was, because I deleted Facebook before that, which I would suggest everyone does because it's like super good to do. And but like people were, yeah, I was starting to get emails like saying, oh, this was really good, this is really good. And I think people said that it elucidated like the conundrum of being an Indigenous artist and like taking or not taking Canada 150 money, right? And there's all different people saying different things about that. So that was my way of like being funded by that, but then sort of like not letting myself get away with it, you know, and like referencing it, that's what happened.
Thanks. Any more? Oh, a follow-up?
I was just wondering, thinking about animation, if you could speak about the strengths of the comic medium and what you think it does better than other mediums.
I don't know, because people are like pure writing and pure drawing, and sometimes I feel like that too. Like a drawing can just be a drawing, and a book can just be a book. But I don't know. I honestly don't really like comics that much. Like there's really good examples of why comics aren't really good at certain things, or I can't really answer that question. Well, I mean, actually I will answer that question. I don't know what they do largely, but I know what the medium of comics does for me. And so that's why I do it. I don't really know if I can say what that is, except that it's just a really, really effective way for me to tell a story.
I feel like that's a really appropriate note to end on, and we don't want to keep you here all night as much as we'd like to.
Sure.
Thanks a lot for coming,
Yeah,
Walter.
thank you everybody for your questions.
No, amazing presentation.